Okay, well, thank you, Esma, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. I mean, I'd say I'm speechless, but I better not be here. I want to start by thanking Ron Askin for asking me to give this talk, and not just give this talk, but give a talk on manufacturing. I've been coming to Informs meetings since way before they were Informs meetings for 30 years, and I've been to a lot of keynote talks, and I don't think I've ever heard one on manufacturing, so it's about time. Thank you. And thank you. I'm not kidding when I say I've been here coming for 30 years. My first TIMS ORSA conference was in 1982 in Detroit, Michigan, and that's where I'm from. And here's a Michigander's view of the world. I don't think there was any manufacturing talks there even then. But as you know, Michigan is a very manufacturing-centric state. We make cars, amongst other manufactured goods. And I grew up there in the 60s in, I think, a rather idyllic situation. If you've ever been around Detroit, you've seen the fabulous mansions that were the result of the wealth created by the automotive industry. But it wasn't just the wealth created for the ownership class, it was the middle class, the workers, the factory workers who benefited from the manufacturing industry that we had in place in those days. So middle class, factory workers had houses and cars and boats and places up north to enjoy those boats. And we had excellent roads and outstanding schools and terrific hospitals and what I think was the strongest public university system in the world. I attended 3 of those schools and my family attended the rest of them. So I teach in one of those today. So anyway, it was a rather fairyland existence, and I thought that I lived in the best place, in the best time in all of human history, and I might have been right. But that wasn't entirely an accident. Maybe partly it was, right? Because I lived in the shadow of World War II, and there was a booming domestic market and a shattered global economy everywhere else, and so that kind of helped our manufacturing sector an awful lot. But there was also, that was maybe responsible for the wealth generation. It wasn't responsible for the wealth distribution. The fact that the middle class benefited so handsomely took some vision. And in Michigan terms, the biggest visionary of the times was Henry Ford. And Henry Ford and other industrialists of his age took a different view from the sort of robber baron capitalist view of people like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller and Carnegie, who viewed labor as something that was, a cost to be minimized. Ford instead looked at labor as an investment, and he even got sued for this. The Dodge brothers sued him in 1919 for basically not sharing enough of Ford's profits with the shareholders. And he would have won that case if he'd simply said he was investing in the future of the corporation. But instead, he went on to say things like this, that it was the moral responsibility of industry to invest in the workforce, and employment was, a purpose of the Ford Motor Company. And he believed that investing in the workforce was good business. And it was certainly good for me, since both of my grandfathers worked for Henry Ford. One of them came from the coal mines of Pennsylvania to take one of those famous $5 a day jobs that Ford was offering in the days when $2.50 was a good wage. Anyway, the environment that created, a strong middle class with consumers and so forth, was a beautiful dream that pursued through the 60s, but it hasn't pursued since. If you look at what's happened in terms of after-tax corporate profits as a percent of GDP, you can see that starting after about the 80s, they've crept up steadily. And this is right in the era when industry started to focus on an exclusive shareholder value maximization perspective. And you can see that we've cracked through 10% of GDP for the first time ever in our history. Simultaneously, the percent of GDP that has gone to personal wage and salary incomes has declined steadily and has gone below 44% for the first time. So if you compare 1960, when I was a kid, to 2010, it's a big difference, and it feels different. by God, it feels different in Michigan. In 1965, our median family income was 13% of the national average. Now it's 7% below national average. Not exactly a pocket of poverty, but it's certainly not the fairyland that I remember as a kid. So that's the stage, okay? That's my perspective, personal perspective on manufacturing. So let's ask some questions about manufacturing and where it's headed. So let's start with, does it matter anymore, right? Has it gone away? Are we in a post-industrial economy in which manufacturing is no longer relevant? How competitive is American manufacturing worldwide? Can we compete? And if so, where and how? What does the future hold? What trends are going to shape American manufacturing as well as manufacturing around the world? And most important for us, what can OR do about it? So let's start with the first question, does it matter at all? Okay? Now I go around and ask my economist friends at the university, and they answer almost to a man what Milton Friedman would answer, which is no, right? Wash socks, do creativity consulting, sell pet rocks, we don't care. Anything that you have a comparative advantage is equally good in terms of economic wealth generation. Now, the politicians, of course, disagree, and they say, yes, it does matter because of jobs, 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 right? But both of those perspectives, I think, are actually not all that accurate, right? There's not massive jobs to be had in manufacturing going forward, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that manufacturing is equivalent to washing socks. And so what I'd like to do is give you 5 reasons to start off with why manufacturing matters, and matters to a developed economy like the US. Reason number 1, it's still big. Manufacturing employs roughly 12 million people in the US and has about a 1.6 trillion value add, which, if taken by itself, would constitute the 8th largest economy in the world. So that's nothing to sneeze at, and that's why the politicians are not going to forsake it, right? It's just too big to abandon. Now, the economist would say, well, Schumpeterian, evolution, we can replace these jobs with other higher paying jobs. So this isn't by itself a compelling reason to an economist. But to the rest of us, it does mean something. But if you look at how we got to where we are today, the green curve is the growth in employment in manufacturing. You see up until the 70s, manufacturing employment grew. It stabilized and stayed there till about the year 2000, and since then it has been declining quite a bit. This is in absolute numbers, not percent of the workforce. At the same time, the red curve is the output, and you can see the output went up rather dramatically all that time up to the year 2000, despite the sort of moderating employment picture. And the reason, of course, there's a productivity picture being painted. Since 2000, we call this the lost decade in this report that we did with Booz and Company that I'll refer to later. Something has changed, right? Is that you can see that manufacturing employment is not stabilized and growth is not continuing to the same extent it did. So what's going on? Well, here's a picture of the distribution of world output in manufacturing. And you see the US on the top curve has been kind of trending down, and more so in the last decade. And of course, who's picking it up is the orange curve, which is China, right? Which is no surprise to anybody in this room, I'm sure. But the surprise might be, if you look at a couple of those other curves, the gray curve is Japan, and you can see that Japan was gaining on the U.S. When I got into this game in the 80s. Japan was catching up and producing more of a share. But then when they hit their sort of economic crisis in 1990, they've trended down much more rapidly than the U.S. since then. And the, whatever color that is, golden curve there, that's Germany. Germany has tended down more steeply than the U.S., right? And Germany is a more heavily manufacturing-based economy than the U.S. They're an export-based economy, and it surprises most people. It certainly surprised me to see that Germany has decreased to this extent. Okay, so that's where we stand on that. Nevertheless, okay, so manufacturing's big, but maybe suffering a bit in the past decade. It still pays well. The difference between compensation, salary compensation between manufacturing and the non-manufacturing sector is about 8%. And if you add in benefits, that goes up to about 17%. Okay? Now this is just a point estimate. It's a recent point estimate. This is a Department of Commerce study from 2012, so it's very recent. But it's just a point estimate that doesn't take into account things like level of education, geographic location, gender and other factors that influence compensation. But that same report did a regression to take into account and adjust the compensation for those factors, and the difference holds up. You can see that even when adjusted for those other factors, that there's still a 7% advantage in manufacturing pay over non-manufacturing and a 15% in total compensation. And even more interesting, the blue graph there shows that the gap has been trending up, not down. So this is during that lost decade that manufacturing has been paying higher wages than non-manufacturing jobs. Now, why is that? Right? Is that a holdover from the union era? Well, unions have been under siege, so it's not, certainly union membership has declined during this period. The explanation that economists would give is that this is an example of efficiency wages, right? That when you have complex facilities, that in order to avoid shirking on the part of the workforce without excessive supervision, in order to avoid downtime on your capital-intensive equipment, in order to limit turnover that requires costly replacement and training, you pay above market wages in order to have a higher quality workforce. And one of those invisible citations that I've got down there is a paper by Larry Summers, who, by all accounts is a manufacturing hater, but he, among other economists, believed that Henry Ford was paying efficiency wages back in the day. So that, that rumor that you hear that Henry Ford paid people enough to enable them to buy his cars, that turned out to be true, and it was later a position he adopted, but he didn't go in with that in mind. Instead, he was after, high-quality workforce and investing in it with this efficiency wage, concept in mind. If you pay higher wages in manufacturing for this reason or any other, you also get a spillover effect into other wages because there's a competitive market for labor. And so having higher pay in manufacturing bids up the price of labor elsewhere. That's called the Baumol Effect. Okay? So there's a benefit to having a manufacturing sector because you can drive up pay and increase the standard of living in your country. Okay? So there's reason number 2 for manufacturing. Reason number 3 is there's a large multiplier effect of manufacturing. And it plays out 2 ways. One is in employment. Those 12 million manufacturing jobs support at least another 6 or 7 million jobs directly in manufacturing. So I'm talking about things like waste disposal and transportation, jobs that don't exist without the manufacturing sector being there. And if you go further afield and start talking about payroll services and other things that are classified as service functions, you get even more jobs than this. And so, depending on, we're talking about 9% of the workforce, being employed directly in manufacturing. You add this and you get up to 13 or 14. If you add the even more indirect numbers, you can get up to close to 25% that are strongly associated with manufacturing. So it's bigger than it looks. It kind of punches above its weight. Okay? Talking about spillover effects, it also happens in the output realm. So every dollar of sales in manufacturing generates $1.40 of output in other sectors. And the reason is that manufacturing has complex supply chains. There's a lot of moving parts. A lot of stuff happens before you put together this product, right? And so there are many activities. And no other sector has as high a multiplier as does manufacturing. So you can kind of think of it as like a little Energizer bunny that sort of propels the economy in ways beyond its direct effect. Another way that it benefits the economy is that products are tradable, right? And the reason that tradable goods matter to the American economy is we have a little bit of an issue with a trade deficit, right? This is the trade deficit as a surplus for a while, but since the 80s, it's been a deficit as a percent of GDP. And you can see that it's gotten rather dramatic here. Now, when I go around and interview my economist friends and I ask, does manufacturing matter? They always say no. And then I go, well, does the trade deficit matter? And they usually say no, right? Because they say, what's the problem here? We're buying cheaper foreign goods. That improves our standard of living. And then all those dollars overseas basically get back invested buying our T-bills. And so they're floating our debt. So what could be better? Well, ask Greece, ask Spain, ask Italy, what happens when the rest of the world doesn't want to buy your debt anymore with it, right? It can become, kerosene on an economic crisis. So this is, sort of a scary situation in and of itself. But even if you don't worry about the trade deficit, if you're a hardcore, economist and you don't believe in that, the fact is that we still have a lot of exports. The reason we have a deficit is not because we have had falling exports, not at all. Exports have actually been jumping up, very fast. It's just that imports have been going up even faster, leading to the deficit. Those exports play an important role in our economy. They constitute almost 14% of GDP by themselves and account for 7.5% of the workforce. So it's big. And since the economic recession of 2008, they've accounted for half of the economic growth. So imagine where we'd be without this, right? Back in the Great Depression, we did not have an export economy, right? So what happened was, that we had high unemployment. People didn't have any money to, spend, and as a result, employers didn't have any money to employ people, and we went around and round in that cycle. And even all the stimulus money in the New Deal did not jumpstart the economy, right? It took World War II to bring us out of that depression, right? We don't want to have another world war to get us out of depressions. Much better to have a export economy. All right. Reason number 5, and maybe the most important reason of the 5, is that manufacturing is closely linked to innovation. And you hear this all the time. And the arguments that people will give you, the glib ones, are most of the private sector R&D is carried out in manufacturing companies, and manufacturing companies report a lot more new and improved products than do service firms, right? Now, these arguments aren't all that compelling to economists, and they're not all that compelling to me because, for one, that R&D is a lot of D to begin with. And the fact that P&G reports new and improved Tide every year and McKinsey doesn't report new and improved consulting every year, well, that's hardly surprising, right? That's marketing more than it is actual innovation. So I went on a investigatory trip looking for the real underlying link between manufacturing and innovation. And I found lots and lots of anecdotes, right? I can tell you lots of stories of cases where firms have outsourced manufacturing and their development, and I'll tell you one of those anecdotes a little bit later. But the anecdotes aren't proof, right? So looking deeper for a science, I came across this work, some of you may have seen it, by Hausman and Hidalgo of Harvard. And what they do is they try to characterize the economic complexity of economies using what the economies produce. So they don't look at services, they don't look at government, nothing else except what products does the economy in a nation produce. So and then they construct a big network that they can represent with a matrix of zeros and ones. So they got countries and products, and you get a 0 if you don't produce that product and a 1 if you do. Okay. Now so here's an example. If you sum up the rows of that, what you're going to get are country totals, the number of products that a country produces, and they call that diversity. So in this example, the Netherlands is a highly diverse economy because it produces all 5 products. Ghana is a non-diverse economy because it only produces fish. Okay? If you sum up the columns, what you get is the number of countries that produce each product. And so, for instance, medical imaging equipment is only produced by the Netherlands, so it has a ubiquity score of 1, whereas everybody produces cheese, and so it has a high ubiquity score, in this case of 3, which is as high as you can be because there's only 3 countries there. Okay? All right, well, that's all interesting and good. But what they then do is they do some network analysis on it that's not unlike the Google PageRank algorithm. So for those of you who are familiar with how that works, when Google's sorting to determine what is going to pop up in your browser, what they're doing is they're looking at these PageRank scores. And a high PageRank score is achieved by having a lot of links from your web page to other web pages, and they're weighted by the PageRank scores of those other web pages, right? So it's called eigenvector centrality. And what Hausman and Hidalgo do here is also an eigenvector analysis. And what they're looking for are countries that produce a lot of products, like a lot of links, but in particular, products that are produced only by other countries with high economic complexity indices. So, for instance, here, medical imaging, producing that when you're in the Netherlands is the only country producing that good, that counts for a lot of sort of economic complexity points in terms of this score. Whereas producing cheese, that doesn't count for so many points because everybody does that. And so what they're after is they're looking at this as a proxy for the complexity, the intricacy, the infrastructure, the intellectual infrastructure of the economy. And then, one thing they do is they create a map. And here's what it looks like. This is the map of the world colored in by Economic Complexity Index. And you can see that the US and Western Europe and Japan are high, as would not surprise you. And you can see that the BRIC nations are sort of coming on. They're medium and sort of rising in this index. And you can see that Africa and Central Asia and some parts of South America are pretty low. Well, not a surprise. Okay? But what's the real punchline in all this stuff is, well, what can you do with it, right? And what you can do with it is you can correlate it with economic performance. Here's one correlation. Okay? And what we're doing here is correlating the Economic Complexity Index in 2008 with per capita income in 2009. And first of all, we take out the countries that basically get their money from under the ground. Right? So countries like Kuwait and Qatar and Norway and so forth that have a lot of resource exports that drive their economy. Greater than 10% of their GDP comes from resource exports. We take them out and then fit this just simple regression to the rest of the countries, and you wind up with an R squared of 0.75, which is, in this kind of a world is a pretty high correlation, right? So there's correlation between per capita income and economic complexity. But more interesting than that is how growth correlates. So what Hausman and Hidalgo did is they took a multivariate regression on economic growth over a 12-year period between 96 and 2008. And what they did is they used the economic complexity index of each country starting at the beginning of the interval in 1996 and used that as an independent variable. And then they used a whole bunch of these other explanatory variables, things like political stability and rule of law and control of corruption and things that one normally associates with growth. Now notice that this is not talking about absolute value of anything. It's just talking about what economic growth did you achieve over this period. And the two colors are, they do it both for the whole 12-year period by itself, and then they break that into two 6-year periods to give themselves more data points. But the conclusion is the same for both of them, and that is that economic complexity explains more variation in economic growth than do any of these other variables by quite a strong extent. Now, what does this have to do with innovation, right? Well, what it has to do with innovation is that what we're talking about here when we talk growth is the capability for growth. And how do you get growth? Well, you either have to innovate and achieve higher productivity or create additional value, right? So what this proxy, this economic complexity is explaining is the kind of capability of an economy to innovate and grow. And so I think that there's something here in terms of a framework for uncovering that connection between what you produce, because all of this economic complexity is only based on what you produce and what you are capable to generate as an economy, which suggests that there's a link. Now, if that's true, and there is a link, then there's an uh-oh in here, and that is that the trade deficit that I told you about before is largely, a consequence of goods, because those are by far the most tradable things. But if you split that out into manufactured goods, the blue, non-manufactured goods like wood products or something, the orange, and advanced technology products, the advanced technology products until 2001, and since then we have been running a deficit. Now that's potentially scary in that the very products that create a high economic complexity index are these things. So this jives with the pundits that argue that we're hollowing out our ability to create the next generation of products by giving away the capacities that we need to make those products. Now, how does that play out? I promised you an anecdote. Let me tell you one. This is a story that Clay Christensen tells, and it has to do with Dell and their circuit board supplier ASUS. So ASUS was making circuit boards and doing a bang-up job for Dell. And then they came to Dell one day and said, hey, we could make motherboards for you, right? Because we already make great circuit boards, and we could do them at a lower cost than you can make them yourselves, right? And Dell did the calculations and said, yeah, that'll be great. So they outsourced it, and their profits went up, right? Because they reduced their cost, they didn't reduce their revenues, and they made higher profits. So then, when ASUS came knocking and said, you know what, we're making the circuit boards and the motherboards, why don't you just let us assemble it, right? We can do that more efficient too, because we have some economies of scale. And Dell did the calculation again, and sure enough, they could do it cheaper, and they took the deal, and their profits went up, right? And then ASUS said, hey, we're putting everything together. Why don't we manage your supply chain? It's all coming to us anyway, right? And Dell again said, sure, that saves us even more cost, and their profits went up yet again. And you can see where this is going, right? The next step is we're making the whole darn thing. We have relationships with all your suppliers. We know all the components. We know all of the design trade-offs and so forth. Why don't we do design for you, right? We'll save you money one more time. Sure, right? They did. And then it was one little step to fall down to ASUS introducing their own computer, right? Last year, ASUS sales, share of markets share, went up 40%. Dell's fell 11.5%. Currently, Dell's a little bit over 10% of the worldwide market for PCs. ASUS is at 7% and coming on fast, right? Every step of the way, Dell did exactly what we teach our students, in the MBA classroom, right? Control your costs, maximize your profits, and they sold the farm, right? So this is how it can happen on a sort of a one step at a time basis, and it's a scary thought. Okay, well, now that I've scared you, let's go back and ask: does American manufacturing compete in anything anymore? And this is a question that Roman Kopachinski and I, in conjunction with 5 of our MBA students and Booz and Company, looked at in a study of the competitiveness of American manufacturing. And so we did a lot of stuff in this study, and I point you to it, including interview a lot of business executives about how they feel about where manufacturing is going and so forth. But the centerpiece of this study was an economic analysis using input-output data in which we looked at material cost and energy cost and transportation cost and labor cost and taxes and so forth. And we did it at the industry sector level. So here's the graph that shows what that is. And so don't worry if you can't read this stuff. You can see that there are bubbles there, right? And the bubbles and the size of the bubble represents U.S. consumption, okay? And what we look at on the vertical axis is the cost advantage, the average cost advantage in that industry sector of producing in the U.S. for the U.S. market rather than producing in China for the U.S. market. We did other comparisons, but this is a really illuminating one. And there's the zero line, okay? So you can see that there are a bunch of bubbles above the zero line, right? So there are many sectors for which, just on a pure cost basis, the U.S. is advantaged economically for satisfying the U.S. market. Okay, so things like, you can see minerals and beverages and food are way up there, but so are plastics and appliances barely. But down below it, there are things like apparel and furniture and so forth that are not, right? That the cheaper labor and so forth offset the higher transportation costs of producing in China. But location decisions of manufacturing aren't based just on costs alone. There are other factors. And so the x-axis, the horizontal axis, represents the non-economic factors that influence the strength of the manufacturing industries in the U.S. And so you can see, for instance, aerospace is that furthest to the right dot, which is below the red line. So on pure costs, aerospace is disadvantaged in the U.S. relative to China, but it's strongly advantaged along these other dimensions. Investment scale, right? Replicating the U.S. aerospace industry is no small feat and is unlikely to be pursued, given that the world can only support a couple really integrated aerospace companies. Established intellectual property is another big advantage. Skilled workforce is another big advantage. And then customer ties, need for speed kinds of things are a fourth reason. So you can see that there are several dark blue circles out there. We call those global leaders. Those are firms that are so strongly advantaged by a combination of their cost structure and their non-economic advantages that they have sort of a competitive advantage for worldwide production. They can actually serve as a basis of exports. The medium blue circles are industry sectors that are advantaged for production for the North American market The light blue circles are what we call sectors on the edge. These are ones where it could go either way. The economics are close enough, and the non-economic factors are not decisive. And so, will those stay in the U.S. or go out of the U.S.? It remains to be seen. The black ones we kindly call niche players, meaning that they're dead dogs, right? They're not going to go anywhere. They're out and gone and not coming back. But other than for little boutique applications inside those industries. If you add this stuff up, currently the U.S. produces about 75% of what it consumes, the physical products it consumes, but the split is about half of that production is in sectors that have an advantage for being produced in the U.S., and about half are either on the bubble or gone. Which means that in the coming decade, we're going to see a moment of truth here, right? Is what's going to happen. Either we're going to retain a good deal of that industry or even increase it. We think that up to 95% of domestic consumption could be produced in the US and done economically, right? That's what our numbers suggest. On the other hand, only 40% could wind up being here if we don't preserve those on the bubble sectors and they wind up actually migrating out of the US. Okay? So a question that this raises then is, well, where does the future point, and what factors are going to determine it? Okay? So I think there are 6 factors that are going to influence what happens to manufacturing worldwide, and those are the following. Equalizing labor costs. You can see this happening in China already, right? Labor costs have gone up substantially, so the difference between the US and China is nowhere near as dramatic as it was just a few years ago. Increasing automation is lowering the percent of the cost of manufactured goods that are attributable to labor, and so it makes the decision of where to locate less sensitive to labor costs. Rising transportation costs, which make exports more expensive in absolute terms. Demand fragmentation and uncertainty, right? There's just more customization demanded on the part of customers and more uncertainty in terms of meeting those demands, which makes mass production in advance a very risky proposition. So, more timely, connection of supply to demand is becoming a requirement of success. Additive or digital manufacturing, I'm talking about 3D printing and molecular self-assembly and other technologies that enable production at smaller scales, sort of direct for use than the reductive technologies that we have now. And finally, increasing environmental pressures. All of these, I think, are going to combine to reshape our manufacturing world in at least 3 basic ways. Okay? The 3 that you can see, the first one's really obvious, and that is more manufacturing is going to be regional tomorrow than is today. You're going to produce in the market where you sell. And the reason for that is almost all of the 6 factors, right? Is that if the wage gap is decreasing, right? If the transportation costs are rising, if the percent of a product that depends on labor is decreasing, if environmental factors are more important, all of those things point to more regionalization, and we're already seeing it. Here are companies that have recently insourced manufacturing to the U.S. from other places, in particular China. And if you survey contract manufacturers, almost all of them report increases in business from American companies seeking to produce locally. Okay? So this is happening already, and it's going to continue. The second feature of the future of manufacturing that's evident from these trends is skill escalation. Anything that can be reduced to a repetitive task, completely defined, is going to be automated, right? And so what this means is that those low-skill jobs that we enjoyed back in the 20s and 30s here in the US are never going to be replicated. India is promising a plan under which they're going to create 100 million manufacturing jobs. Ain't going to happen, right? Ain't going to happen. There's no way that you're going to avoid the inevitable economics that are going to automate those jobs, because as soon as you start to create them and the wages start to creep up and the cost of automation keeps on coming down, you're going to see those automated. So that's going to affect everybody. So it's going to be very hard for the developing world to replicate the experience of the developed world, because they're just simply not going to have the mass employment that we had 70 years ago. The way I like to read this is all roads lead to education, right? Be educated or be poor. That's the message of the future going forward. And it's already the case here in the US. If you look at the decline in manufacturing jobs, it's all been at the low and moderate skill levels. At the high skill level, job count is increasing and continues to increase, and there are shortages, right? So if you are a welder, a tool and die maker, a CNC specialist, there are jobs going unfilled right now in the American economy. And that's going to continue to be the case. The problem is that our educational sector is not matching people very well with the needs of industry at the moment. The last trend that I see out of these factors is a greater integration of products and services. And there's two of those trends that point to that. One is this notion of diversification of demand, right? That it's fragmented. Well, one way you can customize your products is by bundling service with the physical good. Cisco, for instance, bundles network design along with the network hardware, right? And so they can provide highly customized solutions that they would not be able to provide if they didn't bundle the software with the hardware. And other bundles like that are, iPad, iTunes, the Kindle store and ebooks and so forth. But there's a second type of hybrid service physical good product appearing, and those are represented by REI here, where you can rent skis instead of buy them. Xerox, where you can lease a copier instead of buying it, and Interface Carpeting, where you can lease floor covering services instead of buying carpet. And the reason that I think has merit in the future is because of these environmental pressures. By leasing floor covering services from Interface, they come in, check it out, and if it's stained or worn, they take out the squares of carpet that are worn, replace them with the new stuff, and they bring the old stuff back. It doesn't go into a landfill, it goes back to the company, and it's a recyclable product. You heat it up and the constituent parts come apart and they can reuse it, right? So it closes the supply chain via the business model, right? And so I think that that's something that we'll see more of and lends itself to potential creative business models. Okay, so there's some future things. What can we do, right? Those of us in OR. Well, I think that there are a number of things that we can do, some of which are the kind of stuff we always do, right? So if we're looking at manufacturing, we can look at what factors drive performance. Good old modeling, right? Using those, how can we improve the system? Good old optimization, right? Designing new business models, right, that take advantage of the underlying structure. And finally, analyzing the industry to predict impacts of changes. All of those are things that we do now. And they're I ran out of space on this slide, but I could have put lots more blocks on there. But just some interesting ones. For instance, the cost of complexity. You have long supply chains that spread all around the world, right? How costly is that? What is the cost of risk? How do you evaluate that accurately? It was very clear to people my age who worked in manufacturing that the pendulum swung too far, that we outsourced well past the economic point because of this, but it wasn't apparent to the people that were doing it because we didn't have good models to actually calculate that. Under system improvement, learning networks, how do you spread good practices across the enterprise? So social network models and so forth. Some things that we're starting to see in our community are interesting research topics there. Over under business model design, I mentioned product service hybrids. I think that's a really interesting topic, to design new business models where you don't actually sell anything, but you provide a service instead of a good, right? And finally, under industry analysis, there's a bunch of good ones like statutory tax rates. We have the highest in the world right now, and but we don't collect it, which is a really frustrating thing. So we both chase industry out of the economy and don't collect the revenue from it. So that was a theme that came up over and over and over in our survey of manufacturers. Anyway, but I don't want to dwell on these because these are things that you would come up with anyway, right? Let's talk about some bigger stuff, bigger fish to fry. In the course of talking about manufacturing, it was just unavoidable to run up against innovation, education, and employment, right? There's just no way to think about the manufacturing problem without addressing these sectors. But while we have some people working in the innovation space in our field, we have virtually nobody working in education or employment as a research focus. So here's a place where there's some low-hanging fruit and a whole bunch of space, right? You can get that first mover advantage by getting in on these on the ground floor. So let's ask some questions that might be relevant to operations research people inside these spaces. So starting with innovation, what is the role of physical co-location in this digital everything age, does it matter? Physical proximity matter anymore? And I've got a paper coming out in PALMS any time now with Sayed Iravani and Bilal Gokpinar that studies the impact of splitting up design tasks, designing the same subsystem in two different geographic locations, or multiple geographic locations actually. And what we found, the punchline of that paper is that for simple products, it actually improves performance, that you actually do better by dividing up design across the globe and using sort of your best capabilities. But for complex products, and we use a network analysis to evaluate what complexity is, it goes the other way. Timeliness and accuracy go down precipitously with diversification. Now, does that hold up under a combination of design and production tasks? Well, it remains to be seen. This hasn't really been pursued. And that's why I threw up that Hidalgo Hausman stuff, that used the network characterization of economies. If you used a network characterization of industries, you might be able to uncover this question of how important physical proximity actually is. That then leads us to the issue of clusters, right? Is how important is a cluster? I mean, the Silicon Valley is a cluster that's been studied to death, but there are literally thousands of clusters in the US economy on much smaller scale. How important are those to the performance of manufacturing firms? Well, we really don't know. This is something that we could investigate. How will regionalization, if I'm right with my prediction that manufacturing is going to be increasingly regionalized, so more stuff is going to be made all over the world, then where your manufacturing facilities are located is not going to be the decisive factor for where your design function goes. It's going to depend on other things. Clusters are one possibility. Another possibility is, where do you have an educated workforce, right? And I think that is going to be a big determinant. Right now, Apple is telling us that the reason that they're in China over at Foxconn has nothing to do with labor costs. It has everything to do with being able to marshal thousands of technically trained workers on the spur of the moment to meet their needs. And so education is going to be increasingly important to economic growth. It's not that it hasn't been. But in terms of what OR people could offer here, are better metrics beyond the standardized tests, the sort of cheap and easy stuff of countries with high standardized tests also have high growth. Well, there's a lot of endogeneity in that kind of a conclusion. So better metrics that probe deeper into the educational system and its effect on employment and on economic growth are important. So that's the kind of high, 30,000 foot level. But what about the low level, right? What about applying lean or other manufacturing techniques to education, right? We've got, I don't know how many talks going on at this conference on lean and other related techniques in healthcare. We're doing that all over the place in healthcare, but nobody's doing it in education, right? I bet there's not a single session on that. But we should, right? The impact could be as great as that on healthcare. So, wide open field. Finally, employment. I started out with employment with Henry Ford. I'm going to finish up here with this. How do we incorporate the fact that human beings are not just, units of capacity, but they're rather, social and emotional beings who are motivated by their environments? How do we take that into account? And how do we optimize compensation with that taken into account? And how do we take into account social implications of employment? That is, that we make better customers out of our employees. So let me finish with a little allegory in this space, just to, illustrate what I have in mind here. Okay? This is Michigan back in the 60s when I was a kid, right? All the good eggs, that is the employers, were paying high wages and good benefits, and the customers, or the workers, were well paid and therefore able to be good consumers, right? And so everybody was happy. Business was good, growth was high, we were making, personal incomes 13% above the national average. Until one day, one bad egg decided that they could pay less, right? Because these were above market wages. People would still come into work, right? And by reducing their labor cost, they would make their balance sheet look better. Wall Street would love them, right? Their stock prices would go up and they'd be, get tremendous bonuses, right? And then everybody else would look over there and go, hey, how come, the workforce is still well paid here because it's only one deviant here that's gone away. And so therefore, the economy's going well until everybody else looks over there and says, we want to do that too. And once they do, now we've impoverished the workforce. They're no longer good customers and everybody is poorer than they were before. This is a tragedy of the commons, right? It's basically everybody acts in their own self-interests and everybody winds up worse off. But there's a way out of this, possibly. And that is, there are some renegades out there now who are using compensation workforce practices that are not aimed at lowering the cost of the workforce to the greatest extent. Southwest Airlines is heavily unionized, pays higher than industry average wages, and are among the most successful airlines in the industry. Costco pays nearly double total compensation that Walmart pays its Sam's Club employees. But the economic calculations look like the actual labor cost is lower for Costco than it is for Walmart. And the reason is that their turnover is much lower and their sales per employee is much higher at Costco than it is at Walmart. And the example I like to give is FelPro. This is a gasket maker that, whose president used to come and talk in my classes. And he showed the benefits that they offered to their employees. And they were very progressive, and notice that they are not mostly pay, but there are a lot of sort of benefits, things like subsidized daycare, college scholarships, in-home tutoring for children, and a summer day camp for everyone, right? And my students would go, wow, you are a heck of a humanitarian offering all these terrific benefits. And my friend would say, no, I'm not. I'm a greedy capitalist pig. And the reason is I'm making 300% rate of return on every dollar I've invested in these. And he would proceed to show us the turnover rate and the productivity numbers relative to the rest of the industry and say, I have invested in my workforce and they have returned it 300-fold here. Okay? So if this is possible, if it's possible that these renegades are right and that investing in the workforce actually pays dividends irrespective of the market, then you could start with this sort of vicious cycle with the downward pressure in wages and transform it by the actions of some company like a Southwest Airlines, like a FelPro, like a Costco, who goes, investing in their workforce. And then when the other firms actually realize, maybe with some help from some OR folks, that this actually pays, and they convert to the same thing, now we're on a virtuous cycle in which there's upward wage pressure, and we're building a bigger pie for the economy as well as a more satisfied, higher quality workforce, and maybe we get back to fairyland like Michigan in the 60s. Anyway, this is just a proposition, but I hope that some of you here, especially you young folks, will look at manufacturing as a very viable research area, someplace worthy of your focus, and that you will have 30 years as rewarding as I have had studying this. But I hope that some of you will even go further than that and tread into those big areas like education and employment, because those are areas of fundamental human need. And in them, you can do what good OR has always done: make the world better. Thank you. All right.